Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another social emotional workshop. Today we are with Avalon Healing Center, Amy Smith Dowd, and she is going to be giving a presentation on sexual assault and all of the issues that you are going to encounter and deal with in coping with that. So, welcome, Amy. We are so glad to have you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. My name is Amy Smith, and I'm the Director of Healing Services with Avalon Healing Center. I want to dive right into the material today. I tend to be ambitious in my goals of sharing information with all of you. It's such an important topic, and so we're very glad to be here today. Some of the objectives that I have in this presentation is to first kind of define sexual assault and talk about the different forms, but more so define trauma and what individuals experience when they go through a trauma, and just how prevalent this issue really is, not just locally, but across the United States and even globally, and really sort of explore some of the reasons why sexual assault happens, or more so dispel some of the myths, and then talk a little bit more about how we can provide support to individuals who have experienced a sexual assault and where they may be able to go for resources. So Avalon Healing Center, we routinely provide training and information sharing with local partners because we believe that it helps to increase awareness, and also our goal is to improve survivors' experiences with the many systems that they engage in, and that by helping to educate and inform, we hope that individuals who have encountered working with somebody, or a student who has been sexually assaulted, has that skill set and empathy to be able to provide support. I do have to say that the content that we will discuss can be triggering. We recognize that there may be survivors who are participating in the presentation as well. So we acknowledge that, and we do want to caution that some of the language that we use may be strong. And also you may hear me use gendered language. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the statistics around sexual assault. And we often talk about sexual assault victims using he and she pronouns. So what we widely recognize that sexual assault occurs with boys and men. But we sometimes have gendered language when we're talking about perpetrators in particular. So just to get right into this, what is sexual assault? First and foremost, sexual assault is sort of like the umbrella term. So it is related to any sexual contact or behavior that occurs without explicit consent. So that includes rape or attempted rape, what we refer to as attempted rape. That typically involves the act of penetration. There's fondling or unwanted sexual touching that could be over or under clothing, forcing a person to perform any type of sexual act. There is also we refer to as molestation or sexual abuse, and then sort of same under the umbrella is sexual harassment, which is verbal and other forms of aggression. And so it's important to understand that sexual assault is carried out typically by a perpetrator using either force or coercion, which we'll define next. So before we define coercion, we have to first define consent. This is something that we don't often hear about, we're not often taught, but consent is an agreement between participants to engage in sexual activity. Consent is explicit, it's voluntary, it has to be clear and freely given. Consent can be expressed verbally, but also can be expressed non-verbally as well. The important thing for us to understand about consent is that it can be revoked at any time, and that there's also a certain amount of circumstances where someone would not be able to give consent, such as in the circumstance where somebody may be intoxicated, under the age of consent, or if perhaps they may be asleep or unconscious and unable to consent, and or in circumstances where there's an unequal power dynamic, which we'll talk about also in a few minutes. So coercion is unwanted sexual activity that happens as a result of pressure, guilt, manipulation, trickery, non-physical force, threats, and or oppression. It can be facilitated by the use of or by being provided drugs and alcohol, or power dynamics. So some examples of that, let me just say, so the age of consent in Michigan, for those who may not know, is 16. When we're talking about power dynamics, for example, there are some instances under the law where if an individual is an authority figure, the person who's giving consent would have to be the age of 18. So there's some specific reasons why there's a caveat around that, and that's because there are some very obvious power dynamics and differences within that relationship that could demonstrate some aspects of coercion. And so also there is some considerations for circumstances where an individual may be under the age of 16, but the sexual partner is less than 4 years older. It gets a little complicated. And so my goal here is not to get into the law, but my goal is more so to express that there's circumstances that are exceptions under the law. And so when we're talking about drugs or alcohol, there are the common substances that we hear about, like roofies or GHB. Those are what we refer to often as date rape drugs. But there are many other substances that can be provided and given, in some cases pushed upon someone as a means of trying to lessen their inhibitions. And so those are circumstances where explicit consent may not be present. So the scope of the problem, the statistics, this first and foremost, sexual assault is one of the most underreported crimes there are. So while these numbers are staggering, we actually believe in this field that there are many more victims, that the statistics are probably much higher. And that we believe that especially among men and boys. But the statistics have remained essentially unchanged for the last 15 years, at least. So 1 in 6 women and 1 in 33 men have been a victim of an attempted or completed rape at some point within their lifetime. 1 in 9 girls and or 1 in 53 boys reported having being under the age of 18 and experiencing sexual abuse or assault at the hands of an adult. And 2 out of 3 of these cases are victims who are within the age group of 12 to 17, so they're under the age of 18. The overwhelming majority reported are women and girls, and females in particular, between the age group of 16 to 19 experience an increased risk of all forms, whether that be rape or attempted rape. And some of the other things that are important to note is that the majority of sexual assaults, particularly with adolescents, the perpetrators aren't often known to the victim, and assaults are often experienced in the victim's home or another trusted, sort of safe, should be another safe location. So those are some of the sort of alarming numbers and reality of this type of crime. And what also is largely unknown and until recently is how they experience a sexual assault. And so that's something that you're also going to notice that I go back and forth with because of my role working with the legal systems. We interchangeably use survivor and victim. Not all individuals identify with either of those terms, but they're terms that we frequently use. So you'll hear me refer more often as survivors to try to be more trauma focused. But the information I want to share here is not meant to be like a science lesson, but there's something that we really want people to understand about trauma. And that in this case, because we're talking specifically about sexual assault, we have some common reactions that are present when we tend to talk with survivors, and we see individuals sometimes within hours of their assault, and there are some things that that we can do to help support survivors in these areas, so we can kind of try to overcome some of the experiences and reactions they're having, most of which are outside of their control. So trauma, we know, can affect anybody. And there are many considerations around what could be considered a traumatic event. In this case, again, we're talking about sexual assault. So just to try to keep it limited to that. We know that trauma can affect everyone from whether their age or ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, geographic region, all of those considerations. And we'll talk a little bit more about like how culture or identity may influence experiences, but it's important to first understand how we're impacted both by brain and body, sort of across all of those identities. So there we also know too that some families, many families, experience generational trauma, and so that absolutely has an impact on individuals' experience as well. If they have a family or close relative that has also experienced other forms of trauma. So trauma is a sensory experience, and so we'll talk about what that means, but its effects are long lasting, and many survivors will explain after sexual assault they don't feel the same, and an individual's experience of the event itself is what determines whether or not that was traumatic. And in particular, in cases of sexual assault, there may not be acts of physical violence, but the fear or the threat of it is always there. And so that's how we can we best try to understand how sexual assault in context of cases where there may not be acts of overt physical violence, how they can still very much impact all areas of a survivor's life. So just a very quick overview, there are a couple areas of the brain, I'm not going to get into too much detail, that are important to think about. So we have a part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that is responsible for how we make our decisions and higher level thinking. And we have something teeny tiny in our brain, this little red dot here, it's called the amygdala, and that's kind of like our alarm system. So if that's what triggers when something like maybe somebody swerves in front of us on the road, or somebody comes up behind us and maybe accidentally scares us, that's the little alarm inside that says, whoa. And then the hippocampus is what stores our memory. And so it's important to understand that when someone experiences a traumatic event, the brain sort of perception of that generates an automatic response. And there's this chemical cascade that sort of happens. And there's no real way to know how much of one chemical or hormone kind of floods the person's body, but it is a sort of rapid process that happens where the chemicals kind of flood through the body, and each of which have a very important role. So adrenaline is for speed, and steroids is what, well, I don't have corticosteroids is what gives people strength if they fight back, or just to endure. And then opioids that flood the body to blunt pain. And some of that is quite, it is as strong as taking a drug. It is that intense sometimes. And then there's oxytocin, which is also to blunt pain, but also to help promote good feelings. And oftentimes that's what helps people survive such a traumatic event. So with all of this happening at once, it causes the body to result in a freeze, flight, fight, or collapse response. Some of us, we hear the words fight, flight, or freeze touted a little more recently, but there are some considerations around each response that we wanted to just kind of explain a little further. And so in some cases, when a person has been assaulted, the initial reaction causes them to freeze. It's kind of like the deer in headlights. It's the way we assess danger and try to determine what our next step is going to be. That's about just a blip. It's a 2-second sort of experience. And then our body then sort of shifts into response mode. And that's where a person might go into flight mode. So their first initial reaction is to flee, to run. They may go into a fight mode where they are physically trying to fight back, physically responding in other ways. And then there's also this response called collapse. And it's something that has not even been known till the last maybe 10 or 15 years. And it's an actual sort of paralysis that occurs where those chemicals that I just described that flood the body cause a paralysis. And it happens in a large majority of cases. We don't really know how many, but it's estimated that a high percentage of survivors who experience sexual assault experience this collapse response. And we've had people explain, like, I couldn't move my arms, I couldn't move my legs, I couldn't move my body, I couldn't call out for help. I just laid there and almost separated from my body. And so they literally are unable to move or their limbs and arms in order to get away. And so other impact is that it causes like that prefrontal cortex, that area where we're thinking, trying to think and make higher level decisions. It causes that area of the brain to go offline. So we don't necessarily make the decisions we think we would make if we were confronted with that situation. We always caution folks like to be careful to say, like, if I were ever in that situation, I would just do this. In fact, we don't really have control over how we react in those situations. Police officers train for certain events. They have more of an automatic response in training situations, and that training is rigorous. Most of us don't train for this, right? And so where we think we might respond in one way, that automatic reaction in our body can cause us to have a number of different, well, any one of these other reactions, I guess I should say. And it's difficult because what we often see survivors experience the freeze and or like the flight response. And so fight with the boxing glove is not one of the more common responses we see. The freeze response in the body is also a way that, like animals, when they play dead, it is a protective mechanism that is sort of hardwired into even the animals, that is meant to sort of protect the organism. So our bodies can shut down in many ways as a means of trying to prevent anything any further harm or death. And so that is something that is just a mammalian automatic response. And so we don't have control over that. And so, and again, we don't have control necessarily over those initial decisions. So experiencing, the key points to take away here is that it causes that involuntary response. It has a huge impact on behavior, and then it also impacts our memory and our storage retrieval. So there's sort of this shutdown that occurs, that, well, not really a shutdown, but I should say it's a scrambling of sense. And so our brain is able to store those memories, but they get scrambled up like the world's messiest desk with a pile of sticky notes all over it. Every little memory kind of gets jotted down and recorded in the brain, but it's not necessarily in order. And it doesn't always necessarily make sense either. So there are a lot of different ways we see people, respond after a sexual assault. The most important thing to know is that there's no right or wrong response. There's a range of responses that we'll talk about in just a few minutes that are physical, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral. And for different people and different circumstances, they will vary in intensity and they'll vary in their duration. So some of the common effects of trauma from the physical form, these are just a few, there are many, but we tend to see an initial like change in eating or sleeping patterns. We've had survivors report incredibly intrusive thoughts, nightmares. They report experiencing chronic and prolonged fatigue. They may experience what we call or refer to as flashbacks. And flashbacks can be memories that, again, like it kind of generates a certain part of the brain that brings them back, almost feeling like they are there in time and place and experiencing the event all over again. Flashbacks can be triggered by anything, a color, a sound, a smell, a word, a person who reminds the survivor of the perpetrator. And those flashbacks can be experienced quite intensely in like immediately after, or in the weeks after an assault, but can be experienced even like long lasting, and we may not always know what that trigger is. So people may experience hypervigilance and always kind of feel like they're on the watch, or trying to be guarded and looking for something to happen. And then they have report other physical issues like gastrointestinal issues, headaches, muscular tension, etc. The emotional effects, this is a very short list: fear, anxiety. We might see somebody demonstrate anger and extreme irritability in some cases. They may feel numb. A lot of survivors, maybe like there's this overwhelm of emotion and just the phase, people may not know exactly how to feel. And so there's this sort of numbness or detachment that one might experience after an assault that could last for some time. In some cases, we see there may be a denial, especially in cases where the individual is a trusted adult and may have used manipulation and coercion and other forms of grooming, and or just saying, maybe if I forget about it, it didn't happen, or it will all go away. And then there are for some survivors may experience sadness, but what might turn into like a clinical depression. And then there's a significant amount of shame or guilt that a lot of survivors carry that they almost never talk about. And so that's an important piece that we try to focus on in our counseling. Some things that they might be thinking in the initial days, weeks, or months, after years sometimes. For some individuals, they don't believe that they will ever experience justice. And that looks different for everybody. It doesn't always involve the criminal justice system, but sometimes it does. They may be thinking, like I said earlier, if I don't think about it, it'll go away. Or they may be wondering, do they know? Do people know? What are they thinking about me? Are they blaming me? Or they may be perhaps really struggling with that issue of like guilt and blame, and wondering like if it may be their fault, and they may be questioning that for themselves. And again, I mentioned they may feel like they'll never be the same again. And socially, you might see whether it's with respect to school or work or just within the home. We see sometimes survivors will start to have difficulty getting things done. They may be having trouble concentrating, or perhaps they may be someone who was like quite engaged in different activities, but now they're avoiding people because maybe somebody reminds them of the perpetrator, or they're afraid of leaving home or being in large groups. And sometimes just that, not wanting to talk about it, or feeling like people may know. There's an avoidance of activities, sometimes out of safety, or out of fear, but sometimes also to avoid those social interactions with individuals, and to maybe avoid having questions be presented. And then just in general, it's again, if we're going back to the the fact that many of the perpetrators are known or trusted individuals, there's this overall general loss of trust, both in self and others. And so it can have a significant impact. And so if you can imagine, there's a cyclical effect here. So like not eating, not sleeping, it often influences the intensity of the other responses. And so the flashbacks and hypervigilance can, again, be experienced with more intensity, frequency. And then if we're thinking about safety, and this individual is in danger and has concern of ongoing threat or contact or other potential future harm from the perpetrator, we do also see that some of these effects are exacerbated, particularly when that safety concern is largely unaddressed. So the triggers can be reactivated, or excuse me, the triggers can reactivate that trauma response that I talked about earlier. So that's why the flashbacks can be experienced with such intensity. And it's almost like that amygdala, that little alarm in the brain, and maybe that goes off if maybe somebody sees someone with a red shirt on, and that's what color the perpetrator wore the night of the assault. Or it could be something that's experienced in some cases months, if not years later, maybe having to engage with the criminal justice system and talking with prosecutors or going to court or getting letters about the case could be enough to re-trigger that response. And what happens is that chemical reaction I talked about earlier, that kind of also happens all over again. So there's an actual physical impact on the body that is outside, again, of the individual's control. And so they may not be consciously aware that this is even happening. We have individuals where we do come in for medical follow-up, and it's months later or even years later, and they have chronic pain or fatigue and other issues that they can't quite connect. And so if we tend to try to explore some of that when folks come in to see one of our advocates or counselors. And as I mentioned earlier, we just have to make note, we always want to make note of there being certain cultural considerations. So while we talk about this in generalities of, general population, there is a interconnectedness. And so we want to be sure that, as we're working with individuals, that we're also understanding their experience in context with other oppression or other experiences of trauma that they may have within their community. So I'll give a couple of specific examples in just a minute. I can get sidetracked easily, so I try to keep myself moving. But I want to show you this. So, we know that traumatic responses and subsequent healing are determined by a number of complex but intersecting factors. And these are factors that are unique to the individual. So I don't have time to go through all of the different bullet points on this diagram. But if we look at different experiences of the individual and who their perpetrator was and when it occurred and family history and lots of other things, and then we look at what happened, was it one time, more than one time, multiple offenders? Was there violence or weapons involved? That sort of has an impact as well. And then we look at the environment. So are there community resources available? Are there specific and culturally specific resources available? And then what's the quality of those resources and responses? So whether that's from the legal system in their particular geographical area, or if we're talking in more broader terms like the healthcare provider, educational systems. So all those things have to be considered, and we try to learn about their other experiences so that we can best provide resources that would help, guide them on their unique path. So why does sexual assault happen? That's a question that we get often. I'm going to give just the abbreviated concerns that we know impact why sexual violence is so prevalent, and that begins with just our gender norms. And so just broadly, it's the set of rules that defines the way that we believe one should think and act according to their gender. And this starts very early. So we have expectations of behaviors, characteristics, mannerisms, appearances, roles, responsibilities, all of that based on the sex identification at birth. And this is all influenced also by societal norms and cultural beliefs, geographic location, and then other factors as well. So there's the process of socialization, right? Soon as before it happens before we're born, where we start to decorate in gender specific colors, or what's been designated as gender specific colors, and we buy specific toys and clothing and all of that, and it's reinforced by adults and systems like dress codes and things like that, and it's also how we enforced by how we express our emotions and what activities we guide them to, such as or by saying things like boys don't cry or girls don't play with that, things like that. And there are consequences for stepping outside of those expected norms. It may be as an adult saying what I just said, boys don't do that, girls don't play with that. Or in some cases, there are even more significant consequences for stepping outside, and that could be based on cultural considerations as well. And so we kind of get forced into these gender boxes. And just a side-by-side comparison, when we think about how women and girls are socialized compared to that of men and boys, we're kind of taught some to the opposite ends of the spectrum. So women and girls are more emotional and dependent. We're supposed to be polite and docile and submissive, sometimes referred to as sort of the inferior sex and maybe considered less intelligent. We're supposed to be attractive and a caretaker, and not to mention sexually available and still a virgin. And so while men and boys in particular, they may be sort of influenced to lack emotion and to be detached. They're thought about or talked about as being independent and leaders. They're seen in a more dominant role or superior role. They're talked about or thought about as more intelligent, powerful. They're seen as providers, and it's okay and acceptable to be sexually promiscuous. So rape culture is sort of like is the way in which then the environment supports sexual violence by either condoning or normalizing it through our messaging. And so that is also made possible through means of film and television, music, journalism, and our beloved social media now. And so what rape culture looks like in action, it's victim blaming. It's the objectification of women and girls' bodies. So sometimes if you look at ads in magazines or in videos and film, in some cases, it may just be snapshots of women's body parts, and there's no like whole person. And so when we objectify an individual and make them out to be like an innate object, it's easier sometimes to commit forms of violence against them. And then our culture in many respects trivializes sexual assault. It's one of the few crimes that are reported in media as the victim was allegedly assaulted. That word allegedly is what I'm pointing out in particular. There's this acceptance of sexually explicit jokes, misogynistic language, and we go on into things like pornography and with sort of sort of that becoming something that was supposed to be looked at as part of sexual health, there's a lot that we don't really know about that industry that has harmful impact, and in the way in which it's produced. It also helps highlight some of these myths that we see about women in these submissive but sexually available roles, and other ways in which they use violence in their productions. So there's also like inflating false statistics. So we know that sexual assault also is compared to other crimes. It does not have the high rate of false reports like it's touted to. The statistic around false reports is that it's less than 2%, which is aligned with other false reported crimes. So in fact, most individuals who actually report a sexual assault are in fact telling the truth. What tends to get confused are those signs of trauma and the kind of responses I talked about earlier that are largely misunderstood. And so that has guided, unfortunately, the way in which we view, judge, and make assumptions about victims' behavior. And so I'm going to breeze through these couple other ones, just looking ahead and trying to be mindful of time. So some of the things we want to focus on is, how we can dispel some of these myths. And so we love, again, presentations like this because we try to share the information and help provide education so that people are more informed on the reality. We have largely heard over time that sexual assaults are spontaneous. It's a result of a sexual urge that somebody cannot control. When in fact, when we examine these cases closely, and there are a number of different ways that there's been some research conducted around offenders who are actually convicted in prison. We learned that most of these events are planned and in quite detail. They don't often happen in dark alleys by strangers, and they don't happen to certain kinds of women or girls or people who who are sexually promiscuous, and it is the people who are victimized is another myth, that they provoke the rape. So it's not anything that is caused by the individual, but it's more of an act of power and control. And that we could spend a whole nother hour dissecting and talking about grooming tactics and other coercive and manipulative tactics. But essentially, we blamed the victims for dressing a certain way or being in a certain place or going somewhere with somebody when we should have known better. We really have to stop looking at sexual assault through a victim-focused lens and really put on an offender-focused lens and start looking at the ways in which an offender really carefully thinks about these things and makes these planful decisions and ignores signs of no, and I don't want to, and it's not a spontaneous act by any means. So we also want to communicate and provide the same education to our younger adolescent population, and helping them to understand that by giving consent to one form of sexual assault, or one form of sexual contact, does not mean that an individual is consenting to other forms. And in fact, consent can be withdrawn, and it is against the law to continue to engage in activity with somebody who first gave it but then withdrew it. We also really have to make sure that we're sharing the facts around who perpetrators are. And that's why I mentioned in the beginning, I use gendered language, because the reality is that over 95% of 90% of perpetrators are male. Most men, and I need to say this, most men do not assault. They do not rape. They do not sexually abuse. But the majority of rapists and sexual assault offenders are men. They are largely heterosexual men, and they're individuals who have, or the potential to have, consensual sexual partners available to them. And it's a lie that once a person is aroused, they can't stop their urges. In fact, again, I just said the majority of men are not rapists. So to even believe that would be absurd, to believe that about men in general. We have to apply that to or women in some respects. So there are many other myths that we could probably again spend more time on, but these are some of the ones that we see largely influencing the culture. And then, it also influences why survivors don't disclose. And I don't mean just like reporting to police, but disclosing to anyone, because they're blamed. They're afraid of not being believed. They're afraid there'll be no accountability for the perpetrator. Maybe they are afraid for their own safety or their family's safety. And maybe they're afraid that, maybe just they're blaming themselves and can't really process the shame or guilt that they're feeling in their own self-blame, and may have no idea that what they're experiencing is a part of trauma. They may not understand that these are traumatic symptoms that with certain coping strategies can be overcome. But then there's also just lack of support in general and or access to resources. So again, that's why we believe it's one of the most underreported crimes, because if you think about this and maybe why someone wouldn't disclose, we have folks that have lived with it for years that may have just all of a sudden become known of our services and reached out and said, I never told anybody in all my life because I wouldn't be believed and I knew that there was no help for me. So we're extremely proud to be here and in the community. And so there are lots of things that others can do to help provide support to survivors of sexual violence. First and foremost, if somebody says that they've been sexually assaulted, you should believe them. And we hope by giving trainings like this that you have some of the resources and information to share with them. It's most important that people believe and know that they have options. So they can have a sexual assault exam if they want to. They don't have to, but they can get care from a trained provider, just like our nurses at Avalon. Some individuals need time. They need time to get away from that trauma. Those chemicals that flood the body can be there for a few days. And so when we start asking people, do you want to prosecute? You should go to the police, or do you need to leave? All those things, that's a lot that we're asking of individuals who've just gone through a traumatic event. So it's important to give them space and time as well. And then again, accountability for perpetrators. We need to start looking at these instances through a lens that looks at how the individuals crafted, groomed, facilitated, and evaded responsibility without forcing a survivor to take steps that they're not ready to take, such as reporting to police. And then we want to educate ourselves and others. So learn as much as we can, share as many resources as we can about consent and coercion. And we want to start younger and younger if we can. And then resources about trauma and trauma responses. And it's helpful to know what resources are in the community. We've been in our community for 14, 15, 16 years now. And some people, like many Detroit residents in particular, have no idea we're there. And then there's self-awareness. So also being aware of any of your own biases and seeking resources and support for yourself. So as a supportive loved one. And And overall, just recognizing that healing's not linear, and so it's going to be a process, and some time periods may be harder than others, but again, we at I'll talk about our services in a second about how we can support people through that. We have individual counseling and group counseling. We service all of Wayne County. And we even work with individuals who live out of county but want to access our services. They're free. All of our services are free and confidential. So we don't go back to police or the hospitals or, have any interest sort of investment in those systems, essentially. We have different sites across Metro Detroit so that we could offer access to our services, and we're available, our nurses are available to do forensic medical exams, otherwise known as a rape kit, 24 hours a day. And so the medical services, in addition to a medical forensic exam, we can provide medication for STIs or like Plan B and HIV prophylaxis medication. And then we have a follow-up clinic so people can come in and get follow-up care, be referred for other services, medical services if needed. And our nurses go to court and they testify. On behalf of, as experts, I should say, not on behalf of the victim, but as experts. And then we have our advocacy and counseling services. So in addition to the individual and group counseling, we go to court with people. We help them file police reports. We do try to help with like workman's comp cases or things if they it impacts their employment. We work with the schools, school counselors, and then we provide referrals. So if there are other resources in the community that provide services that we can't provide, we try to make sure people are informed about them. And then we make sure that too that everybody has transportation services. So if they have to if they want to come to counseling but don't have transportation, we have the means of getting them to their appointments. We have the means of getting them to court, to the police departments. And then we have population specific services. So we have like a trafficking program that works with trafficking victims. And then we do training and outreach in the community as well. And so I have a few minutes that I can entertain some questions. I unfortunately had to let the facilitators know I have a hard stop at 2:55. So I was just going to open the chat to see if that was anything.
You guys, do you have any questions? I have given you all the ability to unmute if you want to speak. Otherwise, you can just type your questions in the chat box. This is really a great presentation, Amy.
Oh, thank you so much.
You provided a lot of information that I hadn't even really considered, especially regarding the triggers.
Yeah.
That was something that I never even considered before, that months, years down the line, days down the line, you could see something that connects you to that event. And it could really open up, some issues for you. And
yeah, I have somebody that I worked with who was assaulted just coincidentally on St. Patrick's Day, with that coming up, right? And every year, and she's actually an advocate. She does this work now herself, but I'm still in contact with her, and every year at St. Patrick's Day, it's everywhere and everything that triggers that. So she has worked really hard to develop coping strategies and with time, those can become a little easier to deal with, but they're very unexpected. We do have our learning platform called the Avalon Institute, and Benita Robinson, who you initially spoke with, she's our director of outreach. We can share that resource with you and the rest of your participants, but we have more training available. And so I have a full presentation on like that neurobiology of trauma. And then we have a whole range of different presentations that people can access to. So I can make sure to include that in my follow-up if you like.
Excellent. That would be wonderful. Again, these are issues that cannot be talked about too much.
Yeah.
you know, because you always learn something new, because everything is always changing and evolving. You know, I often think about, because you were saying, you know, these events are not random, they are planned. And I'm like, you often think about the person who sits and plots these things, if they would turn that, you know, into doing something positive and good, you know,
Yeah.
it just is just amazing to me. And we got a comment from Roseanne. Rosanna said that she learned a lot today. Thank you. And it was a great presentation. And it was, you know, it's important that we support and we raise awareness continually, because so many people, so many victims have just been discounted and
Yeah.
viewed as, you know, not being credible, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
because of what they had on or where they were. You know, again, we learned how to dress by the social media that puts
Hmm.
those items out there. So it's like a vicious cycle. You know, where do we win? You know,
Yeah.
you put it out there for me to buy. I bought it at your recommendation, and now you're saying it's my
Yeah, we were
fault.
wrong for doing it, and why are we? Yeah, it is. So
Absolutely.
yeah, this even just like, oh, when we get into all of that, like we really, I mean, this is, we love doing this. We could talk for, I mean, for a whole week about each of these different layers. And so we're also really happy to, just so you all know, like, we're to take soft, like, these to help facilitate soft referrals. So anybody could reach out to me and say, hey, I heard your presentation, you know, at some point, and I have either a family member or somebody in the school or a student who may need of some services, and we're happy also to help, whether it's connecting with that individual or sharing information and resources with you all. And I'll be sure, also I'll send a few of those things in our materials, send some of our materials with my presentation to you as well. So
Good deal. Will you be
yeah.
doing our trafficking presentation?
No, you're gonna have one of our trafficking specialists. I believe her name is Jennifer, but that'll
Okay.
be, people are just, they want more of that too. So that'll be really insightful, and we're happy to come back and work more together anytime.
Good deal. Good deal. Thank you so much, Amy. Again, it was a
Absolutely.
great presentation. And you guys, if you don't have any questions, oh, we got one. Let me hurry up and get you. Go ahead, Shirley. You're able to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I pushed the wrong button. I was trying to put something in the chat, so I didn't mean to raise my hand. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay. Thank you so much, you guys. Thanks again,
Thank
Amy.
you.
We
Appreciate it.
appreciate.
Yep.
Yes.
Have a good rest of your day.
Bye. You
Okay.
too.